40 out of 50 Muslim majority countries in the world are authoritarian hellholes. Europeans are virtue signaling so hard on the progressive side that the fundamental danger from Islamic fundamentalism is going to come from Europe.
There's a serious problem going on in Europe, and especially in the UK, which is why Piers Morgan and Jordan Peterson had a very good discussion about it. And to Piers' credit, he did some criticisms of Tommy Robinson, and Jordan Peterson is responding. And Jordan Peterson is very articulate, and that's why I wanted everybody to hear this, because what he says about Islam and the problems with Islam are very, very important. I'm going to point out some things, and I also want to answer some comments that we've received on this subject in the comments in the past when we've looked at it. So let's check it out, and I want to reinforce a few things. I'm Brett, and I've been a pastor a long time, and at One Life Network, we do these videos because these kinds of conversations are happening, and they're very, very important. So let's check this out.
There's another ugly issue here, Piers, that no one will grapple with, which is, you described Robinson as anti-Muslim, let's say. Well, we don't really understand the relationship between the religious doctrine, let's say, and the fact of these crimes. Now, I want to make two cases here. The first case is that 40 out of 50 Muslim majority countries in the world are authoritarian hellholes, and only 3 of them are democracies, and that's Morocco, Indonesia, and Turkey. And, they're not, I wouldn't put them in the highest echelons of stellar states. And so why is that exactly? Is that a deviation from Islamic principles, or is it a consequence of them?
Okay, this is something that has to be understood and has to be asked. He asked the question that ought to be asked when it comes to the whole issue of violence. It comes to the issue of the clash between the Western world and Islam. I'm going to repeat exactly what he said. He said, why is it? Why is there a lack of democracy? Is it a deviation from Islamic principles, or is it a consequence of them? And that should be answered, and Muslims should answer. What is the answer to that? It's a very, very good question. You ought to ask that about any philosophy, Christianity, any religion ought to be able to answer that. What proceeds from your belief system? Is it democracy? Is it the good of humanity? Is it violence? Is it not? Why is it that way? Those are very valid things. We need to learn how to say that. And it's not being Islamophobic to ask that question, because it's a very, very rational question to process.
Now, no one wants to have that discussion, and it's no bloody wonder, and then, so that's on the negative side, let's say. And there are certainly doctrines in Islam that are very, very difficult to square with free, liberal, Western, Christian democracies. And those differences aren't just apparent, they're deep. Now,
he's not saying that all Christian nations that have, or rather all nations that are democracies are Christian, but they do proceed from Christian assumptions that go very, very deep about humanity and how humanity should function. We know this. Democracy proceeded out from the soil of Christendom. Western Europe and the United States has that Christian underpinning inside of its soil, and that's important to note.
I would say on the optimistic side that we could turn to Islamic leaders like those who run the United Arab Emirates, and even to some degree now Saudi Arabia, and the signatories of the Abraham Accords, to find a different pathway. There have been stellar leaders both from Saudi Arabia and the UAE who've come out and said that publicly, very publicly, that they've got their Islamic fundamentalists under control and firmly in hand, and are completely undiluted as to their danger. But Europeans are virtue signaling so hard on the progressive side that the fundamental danger from Islamic fundamentalism is going to come from Europe and the UK, and not from the Arab states.
And that's a wild thought right there. And he's exactly right, because I actually, and I've said on this channel before, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and I spent a lot of time in the UAE, and I got to see the difference. And I remember being with a friend of mine where we were in the UAE. He lived there and had lived there for many years. And he said, take this for whatever it's worth. He said, I don't think these guys are really religious Muslims. The leaders he was talking about, they're business people. And that is, but they do have a peaceful place that prospers, and Western people go there and they interact and all that. They have some limits on what Christians can do, but it's relatively free. People go there for vacation. Afghanistan, on the other hand, it's notoriously, it's controlled by the Taliban and that kind of thing. They are experiencing that underpinning of Islamic violence. And so that needs to be addressed. And they have said that. I've heard those comments before, that the leaders of these countries have warned that there's an underpinning violence that they have controlled, but now that's being not controlled by the very leaders of the Western democracies.
Now, Tommy Robinson has been pilloried as anti-Islam, but there's a discussion to be had here. And no one wants to have it. And, you said we need a national inquiry. It's like, we need more than a national inquiry. We need something like an international symposium on the relationship between the Christian West and the Islamic world, because there are ugly things afoot, and they've manifested themselves in the most hideous of all possible ways in the UK with regards to these rape crimes and the cover-up. But there's something that needs to be sorted out at the bottom of all this. And one of those is, like, you talk about moderate Muslims. Like, I looked up the polling data today that Winston Marshall, for example, referred to when he interviewed Nigel Farage. And, it's about 3/4 of UK Muslims would be perfectly content if Sharia law happened to be the, the principle of the day for the UK as a whole. And that it would be fine if Islam became the national religion. Now, that's 75%. So, a cynic would say, okay, just exactly where the hell are these moderates? And at minimum, their voice needs to be amplified. And then we could also point out that the participation in these rapes by members of the Pakistani Muslim community, it was like 1 in 7 of the men in some of these communities was directly involved. And that meant everyone knew about it, absolutely everyone on the Pakistani Muslim side. And the moderates were certainly, silent and complicit. Now, obviously, so were the authorities. And so that's a complete bloody catastrophe for everyone involved. But there's a serious conversation to be had in the West, and particularly in the UK, maybe France and Germany in secondary place, about just exactly how it is that liberal Western democracies, with their emphasis on the rights of women, can live side by side with Islam in general, especially the sort of Islam that's transformed into enabling fundamentalism that allows this sort of criminality on the part of the resentful psychopathic sadists.
So
no one wants to have that.
One of the things he keeps calling for, and this is why I was passionate about this particular clip, is because he said there needs to be a discussion. There really does. This is very, very, very important. If you know anything about Islam, and I've said on the channel before that violence proceeds out of it, and in my opinion, but I don't think it's opinion, I think it's principle, because the founder was a violent person, and the people that followed him were violent as well. And I've gotten pushback in the comments, but and here's what people typically say. They say, well, Jesus said, I came to bring a sword. Well, if you have intellectual integrity, you know what the document is saying, you know what Jesus, how he talked. He talked in figures of speech all the time. He was known for that, and that is a figure of speech. And the proof of that is in the lifestyle. The proof of that is that the founder never did swing a sword and kill others and all that, and he certainly didn't send out his believers to colonialize and attack and take up military arms and all that like Islam did. It's just a fact. It's not Islamophobic to say that. It's just a fact of history that there is a violent underpinning to that, and there needs to be a discussion of how it works. Because he asks a good question. I would ask the same thing. I always hear, well, of course I don't believe that all Muslims are violent. It's not saying that, but it is. There usually is a case to be made for people saying, well, there's moderate Muslims. There's moderate Muslims. Well, they need to stand up. They need to stand up and let their voices be heard, not only to Westerners who are questioning this stuff, but for inside the Muslim world. And I appreciate the people in the Arab states who are doing that. And that's the whole point. So I hope you'll take that as an advisement, because this issue is going to keep climbing. It's going to keep climbing in the news. Here's another video that we did that addressed some of the things about Islam. And I would love to have an interaction about this, because it is something that's very important to our world. And it's very important to my heart based on my past. Hope that helps. See you next time.